Moving countries can be one of the most exciting and most challenging things you'll ever do. And we're here to take one big worry off your plate: your taxes. At Expat Taxes, we understand the complexities of Irish tax from your perspective as an expat and tailor our advice to your needs. With decades of expertise, our team at Expat Taxes will help you navigate tax residency, cross-border taxation, reliefs and returns, and will work with your country's tax advisor to make sure your taxes are sorted. Whether you're an individual or a corporation coming from Australia, the United States, the UK, or anywhere in the world, we want to help you. So visit us at expattaxes.ie to book a consultation today, and let's make moving to Ireland easier together.
Welcome to Tax Bites for Expats, the top tax tips you want to know as an expat. The podcast is here to help answer the common queries and concerns expats have when moving to or from Ireland. Complex taxes explained simply. We'll focus on the Irish and international tax issues to be aware of to ensure you save time, money, and stress.
Hi everyone. This episode is part 2 of Stephanie Wickham's chat with Amber Dawson, a senior financial advisor from Ally Wealth Management, located in Perth but providing wealth management advice to expats in and around Australia. This is part 2. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, scroll up your feed and give it a listen first for the full story. Amber has been an expat herself, moving to Indonesia with her 2 children and moving back to Australia with a goal to support other expats to get the best financial advice possible for their circumstances, and there's a lot about the Australian system to come to terms with, whether you're leaving or arriving. In part 2, Amber covers the big topic of superannuation, how it works, what you're entitled to, the tax benefits, and what happens when you leave Australia. We also get some great advice for Irish expats in Oz, and more details about working with Amber and Ally Wealth Management. Enjoy!
So another topic that comes up frequently, we've spoken about kind of real property. We've touched on the issues to think about with respect to your investments after you leave, or before and after you leave. Super, such an interesting topic. So maybe give us a 101 on what is superannuation? How does it work?
Superannuation is complicated, and part of me thinks if they could just simplify this, everyone's life would be much easier, but ultimately it does keep me in a job. So wrapping your head around the rules and understanding how to make it work for you can be really beneficial, because ultimately superannuation can play a major part in wealth building for clients, particularly for the longer term. So as a quick 101 on superannuation, it's a compulsory payment made by your employer when you do work in Australia. It's progressively moved from 9% of your base salary to what will be 12% as of the 1st of July. And when you contribute money into superannuation, it's only taxed 15%, and it's not taxed in your personal name. So 15% tax bracket can be quite attractive, and you have the ability to, there's certain caps that apply, but you have the ability to add additional money into superannuation and move taxable income from your individual name to that 15% bracket. So ultimately, that's one really good way to manage your income tax. So think about for a moment, if you did have rental income in Australia or a capital gain event, you have the ability to sweep some of that income to superannuation and pay instead 15%.
Wow, so a really good opportunity.
Yeah, and so there's 2 main phases of superannuation. So there's the accumulation phase as you're adding money, and earnings in that phase are taxed at 15%. But ultimately, the golden goose of environments is your account-based pension phase. And that would happen when one of 2 things happen. And that is when you turn 60 and you've retired, or you're 65. So you could be 65 and still working. At that point, though, when it converts from accumulation to an account-based pension, the 15% internal tax falls away and it becomes tax-free. So you have then an account that is internally taxed at nothing. And there's no capital gains that apply at that point, and you can draw an income in Australia tax-free.
This is firstly so interesting. But secondly, it just really drives home the point that, regardless of whether somebody has Australian superannuation or not, it just plays to the point that pensions are such a tax efficient way to invest.
Absolutely.
Like gone are the days where employers offered defined benefit schemes. From an Irish perspective, we don't see them anymore. They're unheard of. So that was, the scenario where the employer would guarantee you a certain amount of money when you retired.
We still have some of them. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
So rare. But outside of kind of the public sector, private pensions broadly are a basket of investments that are managed by somebody else on your behalf normally that give rise to good tax outcomes. And you've just described some really, really good tax outcomes that somebody can then take advantage of if they are investing in super. Now, where it gets more complicated is when somebody has gone through that process, however far through the phases you described they are, and they decide to leave Australia. What do they do? And I probably would preface this by saying exactly, you said it earlier and you said it well, off the back of one podcast, nobody should take action. But, hypothetically, the issues to consider might be, in your view, what are they?
Yeah, well, it's easy to think of, Amber today rather than the Amber of tomorrow. So, if I was someone from Ireland who had come as a temporary resident to Australia and worked for a short amount of time without knowing the rules and how they could ultimately benefit me, I can see that there would be a pull towards trying to release that money from superannuation early. And that may suit someone's situation, but ultimately they're going to pay a huge whack in tax to do that. And then they're going to lose the ability to continue to contribute to that fund. And so that decision needs to be made quite carefully. And, ultimately there's a number of people that you could reach out to wade through whether that decision was right for you. But, if you're going to pay up to 60% in tax, is it still the right thing to pull it out?
Yeah, probably not in most cases. I imagine there's outliers, but that's a high rate, isn't it?
That's a high rate. And, there's a number of different factors that apply to that. But what I suppose I'm pressing on people is consider the options.
Okay. And in terms of being able to transfer superannuation from Australia to other jurisdictions, what options is there, or are there any options?
Very limited. So there's particular arrangements between New Zealand and Australia that make that transfer slightly easier. But ultimately, the rules around superannuation are the same for those that are, an Australian tax resident and those that are not, where the eligibility to withdraw money remains, even if you're a non-tax resident. So carefully understanding that, it might be tax effective, but there are these rules around when you can access the money. It's still important from what I understand, and maybe that's limited, but I've only ever been on the Australian side, but I don't believe that there's an ability to transfer money from an Australian superannuation account to any other jurisdiction's pension.
That's my understanding too, that it's pretty much locked down. And that's not unusual. We see that at a global level, that generally governments, tax offices, they're slow to release accumulated wealth that has grown tax-free in the jurisdiction under concessional rules to then just release it to another jurisdiction to tax. And of course, there's outliers, and it is possible, particularly across the EU, there's freedom of movement of capital and different rules that kind of can permit it in certain circumstances. But broadly, I'd agree. It's not something that we see. And my understanding is in very limited scenarios, it's possible to sometimes go the other direction from Ireland to Australia. But I think that's where working with somebody like yourself will really highlight to a client that there's so many issues to think of when you start to transfer, especially across different currencies, and lots of questions, lots of big life questions, isn't there? Where are you going to be? What do you want the money for? Sometimes things that we don't know 20 years in advance. So there isn't necessarily a simple rule that everybody can follow if they have an Aussie or an Irish pension account and are living in the other jurisdiction.
Yeah, I have seen UK pensions transferred to Australia. It's not straightforward, and you do need a specialist for that we work in conjunction with, but it's very specialised. But yeah, absolutely. And you touched on something just now, is when we're making financial plans for our clients, we can put the optimal financial solution on the table, but life will get in the way ultimately, right? And so we don't know where we're going to live, and we don't know how many children we're going to have or grandchildren we're going to have, and we don't know where they're going to live, and where, so it's really emotionally connected where you live, right? Because you think you're talking family and connections and, where you want to live your life. So it's not straightforward.
It's not. And sometimes what looks good on paper doesn't necessarily feel good when you live it. And you've got to flex with that. And I think, particularly for people who, have lived and worked in Australia and then from an Irish perspective feel the pull to come home, what advice would you give them? And it's probably the same advice you give to any of the clients who just tentatively tell you that they're planning a move. What do you say to them?
Yeah, so it's trying to, as much as we can, future-proof those options that come about. So all I would say there is, the best financial position I can put you in may not be right for you because it won't take into account exactly your circumstances. So what I would recommend is getting on the front foot, talking to someone early to understand as much as you can what each pathway looks like so that you're armed with enough information to make that informed decision.
Yeah, brilliant. It's a really good way of summarising it. And in terms of the biggest mistakes you've seen people make, not to kind of pull out your war stories, but as a word of caution?
Look, I'm trying to think of the worst one. There's been a few doozies, but ultimately, I think because of the way that property markets have moved in Australia and those capital gains positions that have been created, we can be talking hundreds of thousands of dollars when the timing is off. So I think before you make a decision to sell a property in Australia as a non-resident, definitely seek out advice to understand what that means for you, because that's the big ticket item that can really affect, grand plans and lifelong goals.
Maybe then just to kind of give a nod to the people who might be looking at going back to Australia after being abroad. We sometimes have Irish people who go to Australia, come back to Ireland, and then go back to Australia again. Is there anything else that we need them to be aware of if they're re-entering the Aussie system?
No, but ultimately understanding your end goals can change, but having goals is ideal. What we do see a lot of is as people move around the world, they're having these fantastic lives, but they fail to think about the tomorrow or the outcomes of the actions they make today and the implications of those. So, and I think it sort of gives us a guiding star in a way to go, these are my goals, and it helps shape our lives to make sure that we do achieve what we're looking at to achieve. Because ultimately then you get to, our later working years and you think, oh, I've run out of time to achieve that goal. So it's really nice to, I implore people to take that time to sit down, whether it be with, a significant other or otherwise, just to understand exactly what's on their bucket list and what they're looking to achieve in their life. Because I love those conversations with my clients. And I think when you couple that financial planning and implications, wealth can support you to have these most amazing opportunities and experiences, and we can plan for that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, anything is possible most things are possible if you put your mind to it. If people are connecting with you, Amber, I would presume that you're well connected yourself in terms of being able to connect them with legal advisors, bring in specialists on tax or pension transfers if needed, as you've alluded to. Is that correct? In other words, you'd find, I imagine, Ally Wealth has a good connection, a good referral partner network.
Yeah, we have to, because we know what we're good at, and that, it is guiding our clients as they move around the world, but we can't be everything to everyone. And so we know that we need to bring in the support of professionals in different spaces to support our clients. Ultimately, I've become sort of like the financial concierge for people because they come to me for those people. They want a connection to be able to rely on and get what they need done. So yeah, whether it be an estate planning lawyer, accountants, both in Australia and abroad, we've got connections all around the world.
I love that phrase, financial concierge. Brilliant. Summarises exactly the problem you're solving. So people should be proactive. Any other key takeaways before we tell them about all the lovely offers you have for them if they make contact with you after listening to this?
I think that financial planning in particular in Australia has gone through quite a transformation stage. So in 2019, the government did a really rigorous review of the industry. And since then, we've seen advisor numbers in Australia drop from sort of 30,000 to half of that, because they basically came out and said that we needed all this education, and some people decided not to take that up. That just gives context to, we are a profession now, and you should reach out to us as a profession. not as a sales force. And so you shouldn't feel sold to ever by a financial professional. You should feel supported. And if you don't feel that, you've got the wrong fit.
Yeah, really good advice. And I think particularly for expats who, not from Australia, but from other jurisdictions in the world, the observation I'd have, I'm not a financial planner or an investment advisor at all, but from a tax perspective, we tend to look over their shoulder sometimes and look at the tax consequences. And sometimes you can notice that some of the products that they've been sold are very expensive or maybe aren't necessarily suited to the situation they now find themselves in. And I think that's a really lovely point you've made, is that there should be a relationship of trust there, and trust that, you're getting the best advice for the situation. So therefore, working with somebody who understands the nuances of being an expat versus being a Joe Public, lives in the country they were born and raised in. It's different, isn't it? You need a bit of hand-holding.
You need hand-holding, but you ultimately do need the ability to trust, because you don't know all the answers. And so, I think building those relationships, I'm really a strong advocate for, and I'll just pipe in with this, tidbit just right at the end is, we're two females having a conversation about taxes and finances, and how fantastic is that? So as people move around the world, I would always really strongly recommend that, in a partnership, both come to the table and have those conversations. I'm really passionate about that. And I think potentially there's been, or historically, the male takes a role abroad and the woman sort of follows along, maybe with some kids in tow. But I think the times are changing where, partnerships are a team and they should be making financial decisions as a team.
100% agree. I completely agree. We know statistically in Ireland that female salary levels are, lower than male counterparts, that pension contribution rates aren't necessarily equivalent. So it just really emphasises the need to be proactive regardless of your position or your current work situation. But yeah, it's a really good point. Listeners of the podcast have been offered a complimentary strategy discussion paper by Ally Wealth Management. And my understanding is this would review their current assets in Australia and highlight some key areas of consideration for them. That's really generous. Thank you very much. So if people are interested in that offer, how should they reach you, Amber? We'll drop your contact details into the show notes, but it's always great if you can let people know how they can make contact. And of course, we'd like them to mention the podcast when they do so they can access that offer you very kindly made.
Yeah, thank you. So you will find that most financial planners will offer a complimentary introductory call, and that's quite normal. And that's kind of a little mini interview on both sides to make sure that there's a right fit there. But I think going that step further of taking into consideration actual numbers and breaking them down to where you're at right now and potential pathways you can take can be really valuable. So ultimately, reach out, Amber Dawson on LinkedIn, email. I suppose there are two ways that are absolutely, welcome to receive queries. And I'm an open book, really. I shouldn't say this. I'm very busy and I can only take very strict phone calls. That's not really true. I'm a working mum. I love a chat. I love talking through people's, interesting scenarios. And I really absolutely take my hat off to those that I feel like they might be starting conversations too early. You don't have to be a wealthy person to have a conversation with a financial planner, but ultimately working together should put you in a better position. That's the whole point. So
definitely. Yeah, I agree. And I think as well, just being able to go into the conversation, and if you are not financially literate, you can still sit at the table and ask very valid questions. There are no stupid questions. We try and drive that home to our clients. From a tax perspective, this is complex stuff, and it's just start the conversation. Your email address is
amber.dawson@allywealth.com.au.
Amazing. It'll be in the show notes. I've really enjoyed our chat, particularly because I know you are sitting very close to where I used to live in Perth, a city I miss and a gorgeous city. I'm sure the sun is shining in Perth right now.
Pretty good, yeah.
It's a common theme. It's a bit overcast in Ireland today. But look, hopefully our paths will cross again, Amber. And thank you so much for the valuable content you've provided for our listeners. And I'm sure we'll connect and chat again at some point in the future. Thank you so much and have a lovely evening.
Thanks, Steph. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Tax Bites for Expats. Please do leave a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcast. And as always, remember to take professional tax advice specific to your personal circumstances before acting or refraining from action in connection with the matters dealt with in this series. The material in this podcast is intended to give general guidance only.